Welcome to Architecture at the Auditorium, Exploring with the Experts. I'm Regan, CEO of the Auditorium Theatre. You're about to join an exclusive tour of Chicago's Auditorium Theatre with 4 of our experts. Each expert will explore a different element of the theater's architecture, focusing on light, the iconic arches, stained glass, and ornament. Moderating our first 3 episodes will be McNicholas, Chicago architect and Auditorium Theatre Board Member. I have the pleasure of joining Matt for the 4th episode, where we focus on ornament. The Auditorium Theatre is a national historic landmark known around the world for its perfect acoustics, pioneering architecture, and stunning design. In 1889, this Adler and Sullivan masterpiece opened to immense critical acclaim from all around the world. Today, it continues as a living and breathing performing arts space where we host dance, theater, music, and speakers. On this week's episode, Matt sits down with Facilities Committee member and construction expert Anne Voshel to discuss our iconic arches. Enjoy.
Well, welcome, Anne. We're here in the majestic Auditorium Theatre to talk about the iconic arches, perhaps the most impressive aspect of theater as you enter. Let's talk a little bit about the elliptical design of them.
One of the things that Adler had was an incredible interest in the acoustical performance of performance spaces. And he had decided that the gramophone or the trumpet horn was an excellent way for conveying sound. And so that actually is a series of ellipses. And so Adler looked at the entire auditorium theater as a series of ellipses, not only in the arches, but how the balconies encase the space, how the seating encase the space. There's actually a series of undulating seating arrangements that are ellipsoidal both in and out in the seating areas, so that the entire volume of the space creates that gramophone effect that had been actually invented only in 1877, and here we are in 1886 building the theater. So it was new technology that Adler brought into the theater. One of the things that I think is interesting about Adler, his father was a rabbi. He did a lot of travel from one synagogue to the next, and he assisted in modifying the acoustics of each of those spaces. So he got a real feel for what that meant in the design of spaces. And so he was a firm believer that acoustics was an art, not a science. And so there were a number of things he brought from his background, and certainly the elliptical aspects were one of them. The other is that sound follows sight. And so he took the auditorium theater and basically said, how can we maximize the seating capacity? And so the arch of the seating rake actually increased as you went to the back of the theater. But in order for sound to project up to the uppermost areas, we needed to have, or he needed to have, every seat have a view of the stage. Now that meant that modified how the theater was laid out. Boxes typically wrapped around, and you might have seen the center of the stage and one edge of the stage, but not both edges of the stage. So what Adler did is he actually cut back on the number of boxes, created an environment that actually had every single seat with a complete view of the stage. There's also another real interesting aspect of sound, that if you have a reflected sound come back at you within 1/10 of a second, you don't differentiate that sound as being an echo or a reverberatory sound. And so that was something that Adler understood inherently But what that meant is you wanted to keep the sound very quickly reflected back into the space. So in the elliptical arches that were created, he kept bringing it so that as sound came out, it would drop down into the space and reflect back into the listener's ear within 1/10 of a second.
Let's talk a little bit about the ingenuity of the arches here in the theater, because it was something that had not been seen before. Traditionally, they were rectangular proscenium openings.
The consistency of the arch allows for basically equal reflection of sound, whereas the rectangular openings could create bouncing in various places. The arches created an area that allowed the maximum amount of viewing potential with the minimum amount of height in the ceiling. Now, some theaters you see will have a stone decorative material. The problem with stone is it's highly reflective, so you get a lot of bouncing or echoing sound. Alternatively, you might have fabric or softer materials, wood, that might be something that is reflective, that absorbs more sound. So what he ended up with was plaster that is hung onto the arches, and the plaster is it's basically an intermediate material that's between hard reflective material and soft absorptive material that created a nice bounce back, but not too quick. I call it the Goldilocks syndrome of not too fast, not too slow, just right. And the other thing he did to reflect the sound is he created within the plaster rosettes and other decorative elements is an element that allowed the reflection of the sound back into the space.
Right, and so really the collaboration between Adler and Sullivan, we had Adler, this incredible engineer, really being able to sort of not necessarily scientifically design the space, but rather through a feeling that he had. And the way that Sullivan, who was doing the decoration and the ornaments, so they're really the two of them working together to bring acoustic perfection to the theater.
This is really the epitome of form follows function, which is, yes, are the arches...
The Sullivan maxim, right?
Are they beautiful? They are absolutely beautiful. They are exquisite. But they were first and foremost creating an acoustical perfection that then allowed Sullivan to create his exquisite designs within.
Right, so we had arches in the function of widening the space, bringing the sound lines down, really the reverberation that you mentioned, then being able to sort of follow in form. They could have been any shape. Really, the arch, this elliptical arch, is what best suited this acoustic perfection that they were after.
Correct.
We talked a little bit about the boxes here along the side in the theater.
As a participant sitting in the Auditorium Theater previously, I thought that's where the greatest views are, right? You can see the stage the best. That is absolutely not the case. What boxes did in the day is they created a environment where those of the highest societal ranks could be seen in their glorious gowns, their beautiful jewels, and to be known that they were the high elements of society. So it was really a place to be seen, not to necessarily see. And so that now, with the concept of sound follows sight lines, everyone was visible, certainly to the performers on the stage. And within the theater, as you look around, you can see everyone as you go up into the highest elements of the theater. So that was highly unique.
So in this democratic theater, this idea that sight follows sound, or sound follows sight, right? We wanted everyone to have a clear view of the stage, and the arches provide an opportunity for the elimination of any kind of columns or visual impediments throughout, right? I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to this idea that the arches aren't just framing what's happening on stage, but are actually framing the audience, the sort of lowering of the box status and the raising of the simple seat.
Adler and Sullivan and Peck, who was the major donor to this environment, wanted to bring equality to people. And basically, you were saying, we want the working class to be able to have the ability to come and have cultural experiences. So that the person with a 10-cent dime seat was going to have the same visual and acoustical opportunities as those that were paying the 25 cents. It was a largely democratic environment where everyone within the city could afford to both see and experience what was going on in this growing city.
Let's talk a little bit about the containment of sound as it kind of emerges from the stage.
Well, one of the things that it's a term that sounds a little gross, but there's something called a vomitorium. And the vomitorium is the opening that allows you to go back into the lobby. And it breaks through and interrupts the space. What that does, it allows sound to continue out into the lobby area. And actually, because the stairs are open at the back of the lobby, it allows the sound to go up into the building rather than being sent back and reverberating and echoing. So that was a unique element that was found by mistake actually in the Metropolitan Theater in New York City. But it was something that was brought into this environment and created, again, another opportunity to maximize the acoustical perfection.
So Adler and Sullivan dissolved the back wall of the theater to allow the sound to disperse instead of reflecting back to the audience, right? And then you mentioned the vomitoria, the ingress and egress from the theater. We know that it was designed so that no more than 7 seats were, you didn't have to climb over more than 7 people to get to an aisle, and the multitude of aisles there really helped as well, didn't it?
The sound could come out through that as well, absolutely.
Yeah.
People absorb sound, and the seating, the fabric seating, actually absorbs sound as well. So by opening up and eliminating both the people and the seating, that allowed for sound to continue to project back into the space.
Well, let's talk a little bit about how there's multiple arches instead of just one single arch, and why do we have multiple arches progressing from the stage?
Well, what happens, and what Adler understood to happen, is that as you stepped up, the sound continued. However, it allowed the sound to reflect down in that 1/10 of a second increment, or less than 1/10 of a second. So by bringing it up to different levels, it came down, and they were set back every 14 feet as they progressed throughout the space. So there were 14-foot swaths of the auditorium floor that people were hearing sound within that 1/10 of a second. So there are 4 arches plus the proscenium arch itself, making a 5th arch that created that bouncing of sound immediately back to the audience.
And you mentioned the plaster being used on the arches. Can we talk a little bit about the quality of fireproofing that the plaster brought? Because we know that Chicago still suffers from the effects of the 1871 fire with some of its code.
Yes, it does. What's interesting is the arches themselves are iron arches, and they are hung from iron trusses, then covered in plaster. There's the ability to reflect the perfect amount of sound with that intermediate material. And it could have been wood, or it could have been plaster. And it was chosen for its unusual fireproofing ability. And wood would have been, again, with understanding the 1871 fire, was material that was not being used any longer. In addition, that plaster allowed for beautiful ornamentation and the reflection of sound. So it created a number of opportunities and benefits that were unique and addressing problems of the day.
So it had that kind of form and function aspect, right? Perfect material for reflecting sound and perfect material for plastic modulation.
This entire space is an acoustical element that allows the sound to project. The spoken word, unamplified from the stage, can be heard in the rearmost row of the top balcony.
Right.
And you can create a very small sound that can be both amplified and brought out into a much larger space. Adler did that with the volume of the theater. And so it was an unproven technology, like a number of other technologies that were brought into the theater. It also was one of the very first theaters to have air conditioning, because a lot of theaters had opera during the winter season. And in Chicago, they actually brought it into the shoulder season, into the warmer weather. And so they introduced, very uniquely, a couple of elements. That one of them was that they brought in air and put it over crushed ice, and then brought it up into the ceiling through large ductwork. And heretofore, they had because of gas, they had to have engines that were close to the source of the fan to operate the fan. Once we had electricity, we were able to have more remote drivers or engines, which created less noise or distraction from those fans. And that created a much quieter airflow than had existed in any other theater as well, which certainly helps to eliminate rumble and distraction from the primary noise from the stage.
All of that works into the acoustic perfection, right? You said that
One
on the
more
amplified
element.
voice, you know, at the top row. You imagine if there's a hum of steam engines powering fans in the background, how that might be impeded by that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
One of the other aspects is by putting the air overhead, there's like a dome that exists between the lights.
If people imagine, like in their home, the air register that's either on the floor or the wall, that kind of grill.
Yeah,
That's what these
so
are,
the
right?
grill work up there is actually bringing air out. Heretofore, air conditioning or cool air had come up through the floor, and it was cold on your feet. So you had cold feet, and since heat rises and cold air drops, by introducing the air at the very top of the theater, you actually had a very comfortable continuation of the cooler air dropping down into an area where people were probably fanning themselves and going, that feels so wonderful.
Right, absolutely. So like a nice mix of the air then kind of dropping and rising. And we know that the theater wanted to have a very sort of flexible functionality in terms of performances. So you mentioned the operas in the winter. We wanted to have political conventions that usually happened in the summer. And of course, you know, very warm building in the summer, right? So maybe we can talk about how the Arch has provided that flexibility on the floor area.
Well, you could actually install an entire new floor that came over the rake of what was occurring beneath it. And there are mechanical fastening devices that are still in place today that you then inserted vertical rods that then supported a platform. And that allowed for dance floors, it allowed for political conventions, and in fact, for the first political convention which was held here, you could increase the capacity of the auditorium to 7,000 attendees. And that included going up with a very high rake up into the back of the stage.
I think there are a few old drawings that show that, right?
Yes, there
Yeah,
are.
Yeah. And of course, we know when this was a USO center, when the Auditorium Theater was a USO center, they installed a bowling alley on the stage, right? I mean, I think they removed chairs at that point instead of just
Yes.
raising the floor, but some heretofore unknown flexibility of the theater space, right?
So one of the things about the arches, as I attend a concert and I sit in my seat and quietly take a deep breath and just look up, the elegance of the entire space kind of washes over me. An arch is the perfect structural solution. It carries the greatest amount of weight with the least amount of material. It allows the elimination of columns. So we have a column-free space here that allows us to have that flexibility we talked about in the alternative uses for the main floor. And it also creates such grandeur and elegance and enjoy.
So there's a beauty in the form of it, right? In the sense that it can kind of, you know, we have the ornamented surfaces, we have the reflected light, we have all the points of this golden glow on the arches, but then there's the function of it as well, where they kind of come together to have an acoustic perfection, but also flexibility on the stage.
Yep, one more form following function.
Right. Absolutely.
I worked on the renovation in 2000 as the owner's rep, and this was one of the most exciting projects I had ever worked on, because every time I had come into this theater, I had a sense of awe that just washed over me. To have the opportunity to restore it, and during that restoration, we added new gold leaf to the arches. And at that time, we put scaffolding over the entire floor, kept the seats in place, and scaffolded up to the arches. And I had the rare opportunity to climb up to the very top of the scaffolding. And I always come into the theater and say, that's the gold leaf I installed right there, because the workmen allowed me to actually brush on gold leaf. But that was redone in the year 2000. It was also redone in '67. And I think the gold leaf just gives such a warmth and elegant feel to the entire space, as do the boxes. And I remember I came here after the NFL draft that was held here.
Right.
And I looked up at the boxes, and they had placed some equipment over the edges to create banners or something else. And I called Judy Green at the time and said, Judy, who ruined the boxes?
Right.
And she said, we want you to come onto our facilities committee because you clearly love this place and are not going to ever let anything wrong happen to it.
Well, Anne, thank you. This has been absolutely fantastic. Thanks for letting us in on your experience with the theater, but also your knowledge of the iconic arches and the way they've not only performed here functionally, but in the beauty of their form. We really appreciate it.
Well, the span of today's interview was wonderful.
What a fantastic episode. Who knew that our beautiful arches were also an important aspect of our perfect acoustics? Thank you to our moderator, Matt McNicholas, and construction expert, Anne Voshel. Special thanks to our virtual tour series sponsor, the Ephraimson Family Fund. Thank you for joining us, and please visit our website at auditoriumtheatre.org for more information on in-person tours and upcoming shows. Thank you.